When people think of Charles Darwin, what they usually think of is survival of the fittest. In fact, Charles Darwin was not the first to use the term. That credit goes to Herbert Spencer, who came up with the term after reading one of Charles Darwin's books. Charles Darwin originally referred to it as natural selection. Contrary to popular belief, survival of the fittest never referred to the physically fittest, the strongest, but rather the most adapted. In some cases, this meant the strongest, but not necessarily always. If, for example, we think of giraffes, the giraffes that had longer necks were able to get leaves from taller trees, such making them the fittest, the ones to survive when the trees grew taller and they were the only one who could reach enough nutrition to survive. As Charles Darwin later on went on to implement the term into his own vocabulary, it is generally associated with him. So when we think of Darwin, we think of survival of the fittest. As such, Scavenger Studios' new game, Darwin Project, clearly must be about adapting to your surroundings and surviving that way. Right? Absolutely damn wrong. This game is a brutal arena slaughter until the last man standing. But is that so bad? Maybe not. Let's look into this game a little more, look at the ups and downs and the general gameplay of the Darwin Project. So what exactly is behind the game, what is new about it and different? The concept is simple. Hunger Games as a video game in a small arena. You have 10 players that are struggling to survive in the wilderness. You can gather different resources like wood, leather and electronics that you can then use to build different items that will help you on your path. You have an axe as your melee weapon and a bow as your ranged weapon, which you can use at all times, but you will have to craft arrows for the bow. And your only real goal in the game is to survive past the other players. While doing that, you have to pay attention to a few things. Your body temperature, so that you don't freeze, so you can, for example, make fires to survive that, because if you freeze, you're gonna lose health. Health is the second thing you want to watch out for. If you get attacked, you obviously lose health. Likewise, when you freeze, you lose health, so you want to avoid dying that way. Then there's also stamina, which will be used over time when sprinting or doing movement abilities, and when that happens, then you will eventually slow down, you can't sprint anymore. Stamina will quickly recover compared to the other stats though, and can be increased with items as well. On top of all that, you also have to be wary of being tracked. Whenever you craft anything or collect things from the ground, you will leave tracks. When your enemy players track those things that you already used, then they will be able to see you for a certain amount of time and chase you down easier. Many of these variables or factors for your survival can be affected by other things, by items, etc. So you're not completely left on your own in terms of these stats. But there's also something much more important than that, and that is the director. Now in your typical, less Hunger Games inspired survival or battleground game, you will be on your own the moment you land on the battleground, you will fight your way through and that's it. Not so much in Darwin Project. Instead, there is a director constantly watching over the arena. And what can this guy do? Well, first of all, he can do rather simple things like close off certain areas after a certain amount of time, nuke areas, or place electronics in specific areas that players will then fight over. The director, however, can also follow individual players. Not only can the director talk to you directly through your microphone, so you can actually have a conversation with him, but the director can also choose what to do with you. The director can give you certain perks, he can buff you in a way, for example give you more movement speed or give you resistance to cold or give you a shield, but he can also make life a lot harder for you by putting a manhunt on you. If you get hunted down, the player that hunts you down gets bigger reward, and for the time of the manhunt, everyone on the map will be able to see you at all times. If however you're able to survive the manhunt, then you will be the one reaping the reward as the player that was the survivor. And this leads to some very interesting mechanics because the game is not just about playing the game. Technically, depending on your director, the game can also be about flattering the director in one way or another, talking to the director, being nice to him, and hoping that it pays off. Then again, talking to the director also comes at another risk. The director can theoretically bait you into talking when you're close to an enemy, making the enemy hear you, and then leading to a fight. It's usually in the director's interest to have a fight going on because it's more interesting for him than just looking around the map for something to happen, so you have to be wary of that as well, and as such, the strategical choice can either be talking or not talking. We get back to the director a little bit later in the video, Before that, let us talk about the crafting system. While I think the crafting wheel is incredibly interesting, I also think that it's one of Darwin Project's biggest flaws. Why? We'll get into that. Let's first look at how it works. Basically, you have something like this armor, and then you have a limited amount of resources on the field. You have to collect the resources and build the item. In this case, you would need 3 wood and 3 leather to build the armor, which is one of the more expensive items. You have your more standard items like a campfire that only needs 1 wood in order to warm up if you get too cold, or your arrows that you can build for 1 wood, craft for 1 wood in order to use them with your bow. Those are your standard goods, so to speak. Then you have upgrades. Upgrades are upgrades that can either affect your weapon or give you a cloak or give you speed boots or different kinds of boots to make you move faster and give you other perks. Then you have powers. Powers are what you get from collecting electronics. These are rare on the map, and the easiest way to get them is basically either by collecting them when the director spawns them and getting there as quickly as possible, or getting them from other players. And last but not least, you have tools. Tools are basically craftable weapons for the most part, or other things that can somehow help you on your journey. Now, all of these things are very interesting in concept, but they aren't quite as balanced as you would think. For example, when it comes to arrows, you have 4 different kinds. A standard arrow with 150 base damage that can do 200 headshot damage. Another perk of this one is that, different from the other arrows, you start with 5 arrows. Then you have a hunter arrow that can track your prey for 10 seconds when you hit them. Then you have a fire arrow that does 200 to 250 damage, but has a shorter range and a slower speed. And then you have the berserk arrow, which will give you unlimited stamina for 10 seconds if you hit someone with an arrow. And to be honest, I don't really see much of a reason to use anything but either the berserk arrow or the standard arrow. The hunter arrow for tracking rarely ever seems necessary, because usually enemies don't get away that quickly from you, especially not if you have stamina to chase them down with your sprint. Likewise, the fire arrow is just too slow of a projectile to really be as effective as the others when the mobility in the game is incredibly high. And we see similar issues somewhat across the board with almost all perks. For example, when it comes to the axe, there should be different options that are very viable, but there's the lumberjack option, which allows for faster harvesting and crafting, which really is barely any benefit compared to the others, with the upside of it being that it's not that expensive to build. But then there is also the axe sharpener, which increases the damage of your axe. This could arguably be one of the better choices, because the pure damage that you can get out of maxing it out would be great, but is exceptionally more expensive with 2 wood and 3 leather per upgrade, and it comes with another indirect downside. The third perk is the scavenger axe. The scavenger axe will give you healing per level that you get into the axe from either looting a dead enemy or a dead deer that's on the map. As such, this is the only upgrade that heals you. And there are no other upgrades or items in the game that heal you directly unless you loot a healing pack from one of the chests. The chests are relatively rare, so it's nothing you can rely on at all. So if you're a more aggressive player and you're looking for multiple kills before the round ends, instead of just trying to live it out till the end and kill the last player, then you basically have to go to the scavenger eggs to get any sort of healing that you can rely on. And with that being the case, pretty much anyone out there seems to be going for the scavenger eggs. There would be more of a reason for the others if they were at least on the same price level, but neither is the case. The lumberjack is overpriced in comparison to the scavenger eggs and just absolutely not worth it. And the axe sharpener could be more of a competition if it wasn't drastically more expensive. We see similar things when it comes to the powers. So for example, we have powers like the arena, which will put an arena around you and an allied player or an enemy player. As such, you will be stuck there fighting against each other and no one can get in or out. There are niche situations where this can be used effectively, for example, to block someone off as well. But it does not really compete with the higher level upgrades or the better upgrades, such as, for example, the power leap that gives you a massive jump and can allow you to relocate, or even better, the teleport, which gives you a long-range teleport, which not only is used in combat, but also for a ton of mobility across the field, getting to objectives quicker, collecting quicker, and getting out of fights and in fights and into zones and everything else. So there's so much that revolves around teleport that I've not seen a single player that has played the game for a little bit not picking it up. And that kind of is a reoccurring thing. For example, radar or detector, which shows enemies or shows nearby resources, seem not nearly as useful as things that help you in combat and help you on the battlefield. Or the turret itself is just strange. It's a turret that fires shots and deals damage and hits enemies with that. It does 25 damage per shot, 3 shots every 3 seconds, so it can deal up to 75 damage, but 1, it has that 3-second delay, and 2, it's also destroyed by a single arrow shot or exit, so in a fight you can just shoot it with an arrow once and that's it. So really, the item system, the crafting system does not feel balanced in many ways. You see the same thing when you go into the tools, the weaponry, so to speak, that you can use. There are certain ones that just stand out compared to others, especially the bear trap with its direct damage. It just seems like a better version of the cage trap and all this kind of stuff. And as such, I think there's a lot of room for balancing in this particular area. Is that a problem though? Probably not. The game is in early access and it treats itself as being in early access. And different from other games that just use this title to stay in some sort of beta phase forever and cash in on that, they kinda keep up that promise. Anyone who played the final betas of the game actually got the game for free, didn't have to pay anything at all, and if you play the game now and want to buy it, it's only 15 bucks. It will later on be more expensive once it's fully released, and the release plan is for around 2018 still, but more towards summer. Now obviously, with indie developers and early access, there's a bit of a stigma to that at this point, that the game might just be left to die after getting some money out of it. But I'm not expecting that to be the case, especially considering how much Scavenger is actually investing into the game right now. They did a huge project where they invited a ton of big streamers to play the game in a tournament, and just paying all those streamers is a decent amount of money. So if they were completely uncertain about the future, I doubt those kind of investments would be made. It's also worth mentioning that overall the game has a strong taste of Fortnite to it, not only in terms of the gathering but also the visuals and even how the combat in general feels. Not quite the same, there are differences, especially with the heavy knockback mechanic in the fights, but overall you can see the similarities, and that will attract a decent amount of players, especially those who are maybe a bit tired of Fortnite but generally like the game. So it very much seems like Darwin Project is trying to ride this wave a little bit, but I think they can do it in a good way. Let's talk about some more features of the game. A co-op mode is planned in the future, which I think is always great for these kind of games. It's yet to be released, but will be eventually. There are private lobbies already though. In terms of impact, there is more than just what the director can do. The Twitch audience can also participate. You can link your Twitch or even your Mixer with the game, and then your viewers can vote on certain things in the game, which can make any round more interesting. This heavy emphasis on Twitch is something that we've seen in some games in the past, but usually there were more like outlier games that were specifically designed for this purpose, whereas in this case, those features seem to be implemented seamlessly into the game and it can be played with or without them. Another feature worth talking about are cosmetics. These are at this point still relatively limited, as you can see. There are a few colors you can choose from and a few select skins for weapons, etc. that already exist, but overall there isn't all too much. Over time, there will probably be a lot more added to that. I don't know if they will all be free or if you have to pay for some. I would expect some sort of microtransaction, but I'm pretty sure there will also be free editions because, for example, it's already mentioned that there will be the option to switch genders, meaning there will be female characters as well. Now that we've covered most features, let's talk a little bit more about the gameplay, both from the player's as well as the director's perspective. From the player's perspective, I think it's best to experience it yourself. The gameplay, for the most part, feels fluid. It takes some time to get used to the combat, especially because you use your bow with your right click, holding it and then using left click, and your melee with your left click only. The hitboxes are a little bit odd, especially with the melee weapon, as the hitbox is only at the front part of the weapon, at the actual blade, which feels a little bit strange if you're used to a different kind of hitbox from other games, but you get used to it. While roaming the map will initially feel a little bit unfair because you don't know where the resources are, the more you play, the easier you'll find it to find resources, and then you will be able to keep up with your enemies as well as killing enemies, obviously rewarding you with their resources. One thing that is worth pointing out here as a starting player Get leather very quickly and build shoes very early. The shoes, the movement speed that you get through them, will help you greatly for the rest of your game, because in return you will collect resources faster across the rest of the game, and you will be much faster in combat too, so that can be drastically more impactful than many would expect. So definitely make sure to get those boots upgraded. Everything else you will learn over time. Keep 1 wood for the fire, and that's the main rules. For the director, things are a little bit weird at the moment. I think the idea of a director is great, but I think the way things currently are show where the game has a lot to work on. As a director, you can do things that affect the whole area. You can block off an entire area of the map, you can nuke an area, etc. And with those things, you can already heavily mess over a single player or a group of players if you want to. If the middle zone is closed and you get a closed zone on one side that happens automatically at one point, you can then block off the next zone after that and then nuke the next zone afterwards. And somebody who is in that particular zone has almost no way to get out in time. So you can literally make a player die by being too slow. Likewise, you can also heavily favor a single player by giving them all the perks. Now, this is technically against the rules, but there's not much that can stop you, only that you will get a lower rating as a director, which eventually will mean that you can no longer give perks to individual players. Overall, I think there's a lot of polishing that could be done in this context. Not only should certain perks not be possible to be activated in that order just to screw over a single player, and while it's good that certain perks can only be used once, there should be a restriction on perks per player as well, or I would say maybe don't even allow perks per player. It can be fun to make a fight last longer, but it can also be really unfair to the players in the fight when one of them suddenly has invincibility or something like that. And I think that's not necessarily how it has to be. I think there could be many other things that could be implemented to make it more interesting to be the director and not heavily favor one group or one player that much. For example, there could be more things like loot and supply drops, or there could be the option to wall off a zone without closing it, so people in that zone can only fight against each other and cannot get out for a while. There could be something like spawning wildlife that will attack as well, and all those kind of things like that could be really interesting and could really spice up the job of the director. Also, at the moment the director can only talk to an individual person or in an area where a few people are, and I really want to be able to talk to the whole map and make it a whole show as the director. Starting the match off by introducing yourself and going all, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the arena," sounds a lot more fun to me than just talking to one person and saying, "Hey, how you doing today, man?" Obviously, it's in the hand of the director himself to spice up things a little here and there, but I think he could have a lot more tools and a lot more to do throughout a match to make things more interesting without heavily favoring one player. I would even love for more map-wide effects to be in place, something like no gravity across the whole map instead of just one zone and things like that. Another feature that I would really like is for more ways to be available to survive the game without actually killing the enemy player directly. There is the possibility to place fake chests that deal damage, but that's almost about it when it comes to not directly killing someone. I would love the option to, for example, cool down a small area as a player so that both players have to fight more against the cold than against each other for a while. Generally more options for survival, maybe some sort of healing that has a cooldown and can be used from time to time, and other things that would just allow you to play the game more passive and without directly fighting your enemies, but basically actually surviving as the fittest, in that sense smartest player, who wins by knowing the environment better, maybe for example luring the enemy to aggressive enemy creatures and things like that, over just having the option to kill someone in a 1v1 at the end of the match when the last area gets smaller and smaller. That is my overview of Darwin Project, and while I'm as terrible at playing it as I am at pretty much any other shooter game like that, I really enjoy this one a lot and I think it has a lot more perks. I think if this game should ever go a little more competitive, it will need some no director mode, or at least a mode where the director doesn't give any personal perks to players, but that's another story, and I think until we see something like that, that would be a while away anyways. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this and it's informative and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to hit the sub button and ring the bell, it really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next video tomorrow. DukeSloth, out. So I actually figured out my demonetization issue and it was my outro. As such, feel free to click any of the links around here right now. There will be new outro music as soon as I find something nice. Until then, as you guys requested, I will do the outro music myself. You're welcome.